Hello fellow legends, Warmog has just gone from being essentially an ARAM only item to being so powerful it's defining the mid-season meta at large, and we're going to talk about why you need to be building it on pretty much everyone. The mid-season patch butchered 90% of all counterplay to health stacking. Orc's current health damage was reduced, Cut Down had its bonus damage against HP tanks removed, and LDR doesn't have a Giant Slayer anymore, which leaves Liandry as the sole defender against a full tank meta. But here's the problem. Almost every AP item got a massive damage buff in preseason, and all the ADC items just got the same treatment in the mid-season. So there's a lot more damage in the game, which reduces the average duration of teamfights. So even though Liandry's is a great anti-tank item, it's a damage over time counter. It's incredibly effective over half a minute, but that's not really useful when fights are decided within the first 5 seconds. Health's also been indirectly buffed by the increase of resistance penetration. We have a couple more options for Magic Pen since the preseason, and the Giant Slayer passive was replaced with a bunch of Armor Pen for LDR, which means that at the same time magic resistant armor are getting easier to counter, health is becoming more difficult to deal with. So whereas before HP was just good in the early game, now it's the strongest tank stat at every stage and should be prioritized. But why Warmogs of all items? Warmog's strengths come in this order: the massive amount of move speed you get from the item and its passive, then the gold efficiency of the health it gets you, and finally the notorious healing passive everyone abuses for arrows. And those strengths don't really have any better alternatives. Fimbulwinter is heavily limited by having to buy an early tier. Because a tier gives you 0 combat stats, you're essentially putting yourself behind by buying it. And whilst Heartsteel's early damage is good to snowball with, the longer the game goes on, the less relevant it becomes because its physical damage is innately countered by the armor champions get every time they level up. But that isn't to say that Warmogs is just this lesser of all evils. Even if it didn't have the regen passive, it'd still be completely broken, and here's why. Move speed is one of the most important and dynamic stats in the game. On carries, having more move speed than your opponent is essentially the same as having more range, since you can chase down champs from further away, and it also makes you tanky since you can both dodge and run away from potential threats more easily. But for tanky playmakers, move speed gives you massive amounts of aggressive and defensive tempo. Not only are you always going to get to a point of contention first, but you're also going to be the quickest to respond to a growing skirmish. And the healing passive takes that a step further with tempo cheats. Even though the healing passive is just a nice bonus, it really opens up a completely new way to play the game. Because your health is essentially an infinite resource in skirmishes, arriving first to an objective is a completely different interaction now. If you can arrive to Drake 30 seconds before it spawns, your opponents essentially have no option but to let you control that area, because exchanging any amount of health with you at the expense of their own directly reduces their chances of claiming that objective, because you can just heal it back right before the real fight, which means literally any trade you take where you don't die and have about 10 seconds to use the regen passive, you win, which is unbelievably broken. But who can actually build Warmogs? The most efficient abusers are champs that have self-health scalings, champs that like to roam, or champs that need an easy survive option. But in its current state, the item really isn't constrained by being quote-unquote efficient. At the extreme ends, aside from ADCs and APCs, literally anyone can build Warmogs. Enchanters are always going to get value out of it because they don't need many items to function, and it keeps them alive, which allows them to utilize their generally strong kits more often. For example, Zillion always has default value with his slows and revive, plus he loves the move speed and health since it allows him to get into the fights and 99% slow the priority targets. Bruisers can easily combine it with Overlord's Bloodmail to get 1500 HP and 70 AD. Even though that sounds like they get a lot less AD than from conventional builds, having that much more health means you can get more spells off, which means your overall damage output is higher even though your burst damage is lower. For example, building those items second and third on Camille gives her a little bit less upfront damage than Hydra and Shojin would, but it does give her an 800 HP shield she can use to buy time in between queues. Aside from the obvious self-health scaling champs, fuck me. Aside from the obvious self-health scaling tanks, Christ that's a mouthful, champs with CC who can take Aftershock or who have built-in resistances on their abilities also make great use of it. For example, Alistar's 55% damage reduction ult means he doesn't need to build resistances, as does Leona's Eclipse, and both of them have the CC to proc Aftershock, which gives you a burst of tankiness in the heat of battle. But now we've set the stage for all the champs that are really going to make good use of this completely broken item, we should probably talk about how this changes the meta overall. Undeniably, this is going to be a beat them or join them type situation, and nowhere else is this more true than top lane. Nothing can really keep up with that level of sustain in lane, and a lot of top lane champions have that self-health damage scaling they can make use of. Poke champions that can build Leandries just can't contend with that level of health regen, and burst champions become much less important because Warmog allows almost anyone to tank one rotation of spells and then regen that damage before those spells are off cooldown again. For supports, the out of combat movement speed gives you such a massive amount of roaming power and the tankiness to ensure you don't accidentally die in the process, and almost all of this is made possible by the fact that runes and starter items contribute toward that 1300 bonus health calculation. So flat and scaling HP shards, overgrowth, support items, and Doran's shield pretty much make that condition somewhat irrelevant. In the jungle, health is also just generally good because you roam all over the map against every damage type, but the movement speed also gives you a lot more ganking power and tempo, and the tempo cheat regen passive means after short skirmishes you can gank a nearby lane when your opponent can't, which also means the overall biggest indirect winners of this new meta are champions with high DPS that mitigate the regen and champs with max health damage. I know we've not actually said which champions fit into that description, and that's because it's a very long list filled with excruciating detail, but if you do want to learn more, we've linked the Twitter thread where we go into detail about it in the description below. But until next time, good luck and have fun.